and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Nelson, and I manage the Research Fellowships Program at the Library Company, and I'm speaking to you tonight, not from the Library Company, but from my home in West Philadelphia. So thanks for joining us tonight. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Camille Kazabowski. Hello, Camille. Camille has just joined us as this year's postdoctoral fellow in the Library Company's Program in Early American Economy and Society, which we affectionately call the PEAS program. The PEAS program, which is directed by my colleague Dr. Kathy Matson, supports research into the origins and development of the early American economy. And we do this through an active fellowship program, of which Camille is a part, a very active monograph series with the Johns Hopkins University Press, by adding relevant materials to our collections, and through scholarly and public programs like tonight's. Our presenter tonight, Camille Kazabowski, holds a PhD in history from the University of Delaware and serves as a council member of the Pennsylvania Historical Association. This is not Camille's first time as a Library Company Fellow. She held both a short-term and a long-term dissertation fellowship in the years preceding the pandemic in support of her project, Left in Distress: Women on Their Own in Revolutionary Pennsylvania. And we are delighted that she is with us again this year to further her research on the strategies that Pennsylvania women employed to survive during the Revolutionary War and, importantly, during its long aftermath. So a couple of practical notes before we get going. Captioning is available for tonight's program, and you can turn it on and off using the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're not going to use the Q&A function tonight, but if you have questions, you are welcome to leave them in the chat. And if time permits, I will share them with Camille later in the program. So I am now very happy to turn things over to Camille Kazabowski.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Let's see if I can get my screen to share. All right. So as Christine said, I am currently the PEAS postdoctoral fellow, and I am very glad to be back again this year at the Library Company, turning what was my dissertation into a book. And that book shares its title with the title of my talk tonight. Left in Distress examines the economic disruptions the American Revolution caused in the households of Pennsylvanians, and it has a focus on what I term women on their own, and by that I mean widows, wives with absentee husbands, and single women. When I started this project, I was really looking for ways to get at and understand women's material subsistence, and what I increasingly found were cases of women who had failed or struggled to make ends meet. And when that happened, one of the things that they might do and that they did do was petition the government for support. So petitioning and women's engagements with governing bodies then became a really central focus of my work, and one that let me get at that question about material conditions, but also ask questions about women's relationship to the state via this political interaction. My project then is a story of women who experienced great shifts in their household economies during the war and who petitioned the government for support. And it's also a story of what happened when their requests were in the hands of legislators and what those interactions can help us to understand about women, the American Revolution, and then women and the state. Tonight, I want to tell you about some of Pennsylvania's women whose real and pressing needs compelled them to petition, and give you a little bit of a tour, if you will, of petitioning and women's petitioning efforts. And by examining these petitions and women's interactions with governing bodies, we can better understand women's experiences in and of the American Revolution. I'll begin our story in the late summer of 1777, when wartime destruction and disruption came to the households of southeastern Pennsylvanians. In August, British forces landed in Maryland, and they were moving toward Philadelphia through Chester County with the goal of retaking what was both the American and Pennsylvania capital. And this here is Chester County about 1780. By early September, the American and British armies were in the county, and the stage was set for a military encounter. And in the days leading up to the Battle of Brandywine, which occurred on September 11th, the British recruited local residents to help them navigate the region. And it was because of this that Hannah Lewis, a resident of East Callan Township, found herself on her own on the night before the battle. And I've highlighted her home township here on our map. Her husband Curtis had immediately joined the British at their arrival and rendered them essential services by acting as a guide at Brandywine and then through the country to Philadelphia, she recalled. And on the 10th, Curtis and fellow Quaker John Jackson left their homes to spy on the Americans, and they brought back a report to General Howe a little before day. Now, just a few miles away in East Whiteland Township, a very parallel set of events was playing out in the household of Sarah Kennedy. But her husband, Samuel, was leaving to assist the Americans, and I've also indicated East Whiteland on our map. Brandywine resulted in a British victory, and over the course of the next few weeks, British and American forces remained in and moved through the county, and civilians recorded plunder and a multitude of household disruptions as a result. In 1782, Pennsylvania's government collected some of the claims that accounted for British property depredations. And in Chester County, many of those claims recounted losses specifically around Brandywine, but then also through the 9-month British occupation of Philadelphia. Chester Countyans reported over 45,000 pounds worth of losses, and a comparable source for Philadelphia County tabulated over 210,000 pounds worth of damages. Now, one of the claimants was Sarah Kennedy, and she petitioned in 1782. But she was petitioning for events that happened on September 15th, 1777, which is 245 years ago to this day. On that day, Sarah fled her home as the British destroyed her family's property, and her petition valued losses at over 273 pounds. And I have a transcription here, which gives you a sense of the property damage and what was taken and what she reported again in 1782 when she made that claim. But on the 15th, when British troops arrived and camped on the family's land, Sarah, her 4 children, and an enslaved woman named Rena were home, while Samuel was working with the Americans and serving in his role as a senior surgeon in the military hospitals. The British left the Kennedys' home in ruins, Sarah recalled, with the fences consumed and the grain all dislodged. All the indignities were offered to our house. We all fled and left our stock, our grain, our furniture, which fell into their hands. The windows of our house they broke to pieces. Our furniture they carried out and burned. I and my little ones went to my father's, as these parts were all ravaged by the British, no cattle or provisions left. Sarah stayed with her father for 3 weeks in Oxford Township, but after that she returned to what she called her waste house. Sarah Kennedy's description of events on the days surrounding Brandywine reflected what hundreds of others experienced: plunder, destruction, upheaval, and changed economic circumstances. Fellow Chester County and Rachel Hannings reported the loss of 2 cows, 1 heifer, 2 hogs, and the destruction of 3 acres of rye, a ½ an acre of flax, bedclothes, wearing apparel, household furniture, yarn, and 50 pounds of cheese. James Dunwoody reported that the British damaged sown wheat and rye because they encamped on it. Abel Reese watched as British soldiers cut down 16 of his apple trees and pulled down 2 ends of his barn and then cut a plow to pieces. And Charles Dilworth had just harvested some of his wheat, which British soldiers took, and a week later they came back for the rest of it. Now, of course, I should note that these are damages caused by the British, and the American army was also quite capable of causing comparable types of destruction. And if you are interested in Chester County and the movement of British troops through that region, I'd like to suggest that you check out the Chester County 1777 Atlas Project, and I believe a link is going to be sent out in the chat. Now, such losses, as I've just described, would have fundamentally altered household economies. The arrival of any army on farmland would reduce its yield and disrupt patterns of cultivation for seasons to come. Losses of crops in the ground or those already harvested or preserved would have brought significant challenges to feeding families and livestock. And the timing of events that September also meant that there'd be almost no time to replant or attend to repairs before winter. Losses of personal property were likewise not easily remedied. Consider textiles, for example. Individuals might need to obtain scarce new materials to spin or weave or sew. And even if people possessed those skills and had raw materials, maybe they lost other essential items like a spinning wheel. Lost property indicated lost labor and steep new costs to a household in a time of sustained crisis. Property losses were just part of the story of disruption and altered circumstances. A number of Pennsylvania women found themselves on their own as husbands and male family members joined the Americans or British or fled within their lines for safety. And that too would have changed household structures. That's what happened to Hannah and Sarah. And to make matters worse, the state's economy was unstable and civilians faced shortages and scarcities. Paper currency depreciated in value and prices rose. Although women possessed economic skills and had the knowledge that would have enabled them to take over and manage households and fill in for absent men, the same responses that might have stabilized a household during a time of peace didn't always work during war. So what could women do? The answer for some was to petition, and hundreds of women did, both during the war and in its long aftermath. Petitioning was the means by which civilians could engage with their governments, and women employed this tactic actively to obtain relief. Some asked for monetary support or help securing housing, while still others applied for passes to move outside of the state, crossing military and political boundaries to try to redress need. From the beginning of the conflict, but really increasingly after 1777, Pennsylvania's women turned to their local government for assistance. Isabelle Phillips was one of them. With the calamities of the times and without any other visible resources to subsist on but that uncertainty of a few days' work and the hospitality of her neighbors, she told Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council she could no longer survive by her own means. She'd long struggled for herself and two helpless children and was under many private afflictions. Her husband would support her willingly were it in his power, she said, but he hadn't got very much pay and so could not send her anything. Isabelle was wholly destitute and deprived of the assistance she had a right to and really expected to receive from her husband or her country, her petition stated. On the day that the councilmen read her petition in May of 1781, they ordered that she receive a one-time payment to provide stuff for a gown, a petticoat, a shift, a pair of stockings, and a pair of shoes. Isabelle's petition was successful and decided quickly, and that wasn't necessarily characteristic of women's petitioning experiences. But what is characteristic is the way that she stressed her great need. Her petitioning counterparts did much the same. Jane Moore, in November of 1776, petitioned for the privilege of a room in the barracks. Her husband was away in service, and he left her in want of supplies, she said. She and her 3 children were reduced to a most deplorable situation, and she needed support because of the present advanced price of every necessary of life, which rendered her incapable of supporting herself and family. Eleanor Phillips applied for a pass in late November 1779 because she was so wretchedly circumstanced as not to be able to purchase 1/4 cord of wood or any other necessaries against the approaching winter. Her husband's absence forced her to labor under the severest distress, and she wanted the state to support her movement across political boundaries so she could go with her 4 children to New York. There, she hoped that her husband might be able to provide for them. Catherine Reynolds' husband died as a first lieutenant aboard the ship Franklin Galley in 1779, and some of the officers who served with him went before the Executive Council on her behalf because she was a distressed widow. They hoped the council would permit her to draw rations until her children recovered from smallpox, and she was in a condition to help herself. And with their help in submitting a petition, Catherine received support in the form of a single ration, which she could collect until January of 1780. In January of 1779, Mary Cochrane and Mary Roane jointly petitioned the Council of Safety because they faced extreme difficulty in obtaining life. Their husbands had been a long time engaged in the fleets, but their wages were so low that it was impossible to live. The council had previously granted them some rations, and they wanted those reinstated until they were in a position to support themselves again. Women petitioners argued that they were worthy objects of government relief because of the economic difficulties that they faced. Though they might cite the military service of male family members, the real weight of their arguments lay in their altered economic circumstances. Their requests were also taking place alongside broader debates about the role of government in regulating or interfering with economic matters and public actions that explicitly called for government intervention in the state's economy. think about price regulation there. And all of that was happening again alongside and giving context to the economic conditions within the state in which women were petitioning. Women viewed the state as an important intercessor in helping them to address economic need, and they were petitioning because of that need and because they had a heightened role in political decision making, especially from within households as they were reacting to these shifting economies and war. Regardless of the outcome of their petitions, their petitioning carved out a place in the political process where women were forcing male legislators to consider them and their requests in almost every session. While legislators were reading and deliberating on a wide variety of women's requests, revolutionary laws provided protections for war widows in ways that married women couldn't expect to take advantage of. As early as 1776, Pennsylvania did set aside funds for certain war widows, and then by 1780, both Pennsylvania and the Continental Congress had passed legislation that extended military pensions to certain widows of war. And in doing so, war widows gained greater legitimacy as petitioners. Women who had absentee but living husbands weren't given that same legitimacy. And the assumption was really that husbands should be able to provide relief through wages. And that thinking was reflective of culture and 18th century understandings of gender more broadly. But the conditions of war were such that the state's civilian base broadly suffered from the unstable economy. And soldiers who were in service often had low or no pay. And if they got any at all, they wouldn't have usually had very much to send home. And so all of those legislative permissions then got a little muddled, and it didn't stop women from petitioning regardless of marital status or whether they were war widows. Legislators themselves were also willing to consider petitions from a wider range of women, not just these widows of war. And that also signaled then to women petitioners that the government was a place where they might turn to obtain relief. Even still, during the war, resources weren't always available or sufficient to help women, even if legislators might have believed that they deserved support. And being in great need or proving connections to males in military service did not ensure that requests would be granted. The act of petitioning never ensured a successful outcome. As councilmen read women's petitions, they also deliberated on a case-by-case basis, and their role in that process of looking at women's requests pulled women's daily needs into the complexity of the political economy of war. Now, all of this might make you wonder if Pennsylvania adopted any stipulations that prohibited individuals with loyalist connections from petitioning for draws on the state's resources. Although most petitioners did have clear ties to the American cause, some women on their own were not able to justify requests for support in that way. And in fact, some were directly affiliated with traders. When Pennsylvania's government returned to Philadelphia after the British evacuated for New York in 1778, there was a greater focus on an effort to identify and punish British supporters. Pennsylvania's legislators acted on an existing law that defined inhabitants who joined the British as traders, and then the state appointed commissioners to inventory the real and personal property of those individuals for public sale to benefit the state. And these confiscation laws directly labeled individuals and even their families as enemies of the state, and it meant a full loss of property. They might be able to rent certain portions or buy back some of their confiscated property, but that wasn't offered to all individuals. However, in spite of all of that confiscation laws language and its clear punishment for British loyalty, Pennsylvania made allowances for some women and children linked to traders. Justices of the Supreme Court could set aside parts of forfeited estates to support them. Hannah Lewis petitioned the state for that purpose in April of 1779. Hannah had been on her own since Curtis went with the British in the days after Brandywine, and his departure with them for New York in June of 1778 made her situation even more precarious. She had an absentee British supporting husband across state lines. And as early as May of 1778, Curtis appeared on a published list of traders, and shortly after, his property was among the estates inventoried. And I have for you here just the proclamation from the Supreme Executive Council in May of 1778. And you can see Curtis Lewis is listed here, blacksmith of East County. Appraisers visited the Lewis estate on 3 occasions, and they first noted the household furniture and livestock and crops and Curtis's blacksmith tools and valued all of that at just over £240. A second inventory in September included wheat and rye that Hannah reaped and was really evidence of her continued labor to maintain her family from this land before its sale. Appraisers left those crops with Hannah because they said it was necessary for her family's support. A third inventory in November recorded some remaining livestock and household goods. And before it was sold, Hannah was able to repurchase her bed and bedding for the sum of £170, but the rest of the property was confiscated and sold. Now, in the midst of this confiscation process, and well aware of the consequences of her husband's treason, Hannah submitted her petition for an allowance to be made for herself and her children from this confiscated estate. She cited that previously mentioned law, but her efforts didn't succeed. The council dismissed her case because they felt she'd misled the court. They offered to make an allowance for her only son, Reuben, if he would take an oath of allegiance, but he did not do so. And in that moment of her failed petition, Hannah went back to their land, and she remained there until at least August of 1779, when portions of it were first sold. But without land and household goods or her husband, Hannah felt she had little choice than to flee. So she joined Curtis in British-occupied New York, reconstituting their family for a brief 10 weeks before Curtis died. Hannah began her widowhood in a strange country, far from acquaintance or relation, and left in very distressed circumstances. She immediately petitioned the British Army for the continuance of Curtis's pay and rations, and it seems that she did succeed there. And for the next several years, Hannah lived in New York with her children. Now, Hannah's Pennsylvania petition didn't succeed, but other women who were connected to loyalists had better success. Mary Campbell petitioned the Executive Council in the exact same month as Hannah for an allowance out of her husband's estate for the maintenance of herself and her child. And Pennsylvania's Supreme Court determined that she should get a sum, and they granted her £250 for 1 year's support. And then the following year, she petitioned again and was granted £1,800. Now, at the time of her petition, she was a widow, so that might have influenced the outcome of her petitions as well. Women then with loyalist ties petitioned the state because regardless of their or their husband's political affiliations, they still saw Pennsylvania as a means to potentially obtain some material support. And the state's provisions to support some wives of traders did indicate that they weren't really unrealistic or unfounded in seeing the state's role in that way. Support to loyalist-affiliated women, however, doesn't mean that women's economic needs in any way supplanted political fears that legislators might have had about allowing women with loyalist ties to remain and draw support from the American government. But still, their ability to petition at all meant that the state recognized the role that it might play in their relief. A really similarly complicated set of interactions between women petitioners and the state are even more apparent in women's applications for passes and a subsequent 1780 law that was linked to that pass system. Beginning in earnest after the British occupation, Pennsylvania required individuals who were traveling internally or outside the state's boundaries, across military boundaries, to carry a pass. And they had to apply to the Executive Council, give reasons why they wanted to move, provide some details, convince councilmen that that mobility wouldn't imperil the state. So from the state's perspective, this was a system that allowed them to scrutinize and manage civilian mobility in the uncertain time of war. And for civilians, passes provided a sense of protection and gave their mobility state approval. Passes were a slightly different kind of petition, but women's requests remained steeped in their economic need. But these petitions weren't necessarily about obtaining economic support directly from the state. Instead, a successful outcome would furnish women with a pass. In these kinds of petitions, women assigned a great deal of authority to the state government that the state could approve of their travel, and also demonstrates women's continued belief that the state could and should assist them in some way. Women's pass applications overwhelmingly detail a need to travel made necessary by war and explicitly, again, speaking about their ability to subsist. But even if they were then arguing in these applications that they had to leave the state to subsist, in petitioning, they were still incorporating Pennsylvania into their economic strategies for survival in war, because state backing of their mobility to execute these other economic plans of survival that they had might help them to actually see those plans fulfilled. In attempting to ameliorate distress, though, outside of Pennsylvania, and applying for passes, applicants were really ever more dependent on council and the councilmen who would look at their requests. And councilmen were deliberating on that need that women described, but also on their own observations about the state's safety during the war. And so pass applications really embody this intersection of these individual, practical, and daily needs that women had and their own wishes to survive, and then also the state's kind of perception of what they should do with their civilian base in these heightened times of war, or heightened times of danger in war, I should say. In 1780, Jane Gallagher, who'd been left behind in Philadelphia by her husband, petitioned for a pass to New York for herself and her 3 children. She told the executive council that she'd long scuffled to earn a morsel, but was at last reduced to the greatest poverty and distress. For 2 years, she tried to support her family, but found her circumstances so low and her distress so great she couldn't stay any longer. Crossing state and military lines to rejoin her husband represented her last option to obtain a level of subsistence. She promised that there could be no danger of her returning, so if the council was suspecting her of harboring British loyalties or worried about that, then her pledge of self-exile might serve to allay councilmen's fears. But the council rejected her application. Margaret McGuire petitioned in August of 1781, telling the council that her husband abandoned her during the British evacuation and hadn't provided her with any assistance since. And when she heard he was in South Carolina, which was by then a loyalist stronghold, she prepared to take her children there and meant to throw herself upon him for support. Margaret's request, on the other hand, did get a pass. Margaret Grew described a weak constitution that compounded with the distress of the times and reduced her to the lowest circumstances. She had neither food, money, nor clothing, nor a bed to lie on. Her 3 children were likewise much afflicted with sores and sickness, and if she could travel to be with her son and daughter living in New York, she felt they might be able to relieve her family's collective distress. But the council denied her request. Catherine Fritz similarly cited the sickly and low conditions of 5 of her children, and if she could not go to her husband in New York, then she and her children, whose only dependence would be on the county or charitable will of Christian people, she said, would become even more burdensome on the state. And council furnished her with a pass. In these pass decisions, councilmen were really exercising a great deal of subjective judgment. Cases that outlined really similar requests didn't always achieve the same outcomes, and some of that might have reflected the changing wartime or political conditions or the membership of the council. But even when legislators deliberated on the same day, petitions outlining comparable circumstances didn't consistently yield similar results. The council's deliberations also don't suggest that they had a really explicit standard by which they judged individual applications, and their decisions also don't establish a pattern of systematic othering based on solely, or at least based solely on politics. And in these examples that I've just given, it's really difficult to determine why women succeeded or didn't succeed when you read the rhetoric of their petitioning requests. Nonetheless, the intersection between women's needs and how the interest of the state was shaping their request really is playing out more so in passes, or maybe more clearly in passes than in some of the other petitions I was talking about. Women's economic strategies that they wanted to enact were tied up in whether or not they could get a pass to be mobile. And so then if we look at this list of these 4 individuals who were petitioning, we can really kind of get a sense of the murky picture that petitioning, and especially these sources, reveal. And again, while a petition for a pass was to obtain a pass from the council, given how much of women's petitions were about economics and economic need, legislators knew that there was a crucial economic element to their request. So in granting or denying a request, they were also in some ways supporting or not supporting some of the economic plans that these women had. And so if councilmen denied a pass request, they could prohibit or really further hinder women's economic survival. An important side note here, the pass system, while important for thinking about mobility, doesn't mean that everyone who wanted to be mobile always applied. People definitely moved around without passes, but in thinking about the choice of these women to get this state-backed support in their efforts to travel, it really brings their need, again, and state interests together in really interesting and important ways. Now, everything that I've just told you got even more complicated and messy around a law in 1780. In March, Pennsylvania's Executive Council gave notice that the wives of men living behind enemy lines should apply for passes, to leave Pennsylvania before April 15th. If they didn't go, the council threatened to take further measures as the public security shall require. The following June, the council passed another resolution and ordered these same women to leave within 10 days or be proceeded against as enemies of the state. In several cases, women who applied because of that 1780 requirement were expediently granted passes. But there were also instances when that didn't necessarily play out as you might expect. For example, Elizabeth Greenwood, who missed the application period by only 6 days, applied but then didn't receive a pass. She remained in Pennsylvania until August and she applied again, but she also had her petition rejected at that time. Interestingly, the council barred her from leaving the state, even though they were kicking her out with the 1780 law. And instead of sending her across enemy lines, they actually approved of her husband's return from New York if he would promise to take an oath of allegiance. I'm not sure that he made that choice. Sarah Gill left the state in June of 1780 because of the law, but then immediately petitioned to return to Pennsylvania. Her husband had left the state with the British, and she was left behind to maintain their property. In 1778, appraisers inventoried Joseph's property as a result of his treason, but Sarah interjected here too and repurchased the property back in its entirety before it could be sold for the sum of 71 pounds. And as a result, then she told the council she had gotten into pretty good business and she was surviving by keeping a public house, and she was applying in place for her husband for a tavern license. Since 1778, then she was succeeding in supporting her family in this way. However, she said, and this was her crucial argument, her forced exile from the state left her with nothing on which to rely but the compassion of friends. From her exile then in Delaware, Sarah told the council she behaved herself during the grand contest for liberty and independence of America, had gained the goodwill and confidence of the officers and soldiers of the American Army and Navy who came to her public house. And she also assured the council that she could get the best recommendation from the best Whigs. And she did. She had support or statements, witness statements from men either serving in the Continental Army or those with high-ranking government roles. And she also offered to give security for future good conduct if they let her return. All of that undoubtedly aided her cause, and 2 weeks later, the council did grant her a pass for her and her children to return to their home in Chester. On paper, that 1780 law had meant to exclude women linked to loyalists and known traitors. Sarah had worked around those restrictions, though with a lot of American support, but she'd used that pass system and petitioning to reestablish herself in Pennsylvania where she could support her family, and had made her argument about that ability to support herself by running that public house. Her case then just adds another kind of layer to what I was saying about the state and passes and government deliberations, all being linked really to women's economic survival. After 1780, the same kind of explicit efforts to remove the wives of traitors from the state weren't made, but the pass system remained in place, and so too did the role of councilmen in deliberating on the mobility of civilians. In 1782, Hannah Lewis, remember her, she petitioned Pennsylvania for a pass to return from British-occupied New York. And though it had been 2 years since that 1780 law, applying brought some level of uncertainty. After all, she'd been living several years behind British lines. She was the widow of an tainted traitor as well. She wrote to her cousin, Reuben Haynes, urging him to assist her with her petition, telling him she was left in very distressed circumstances and was very desirous of returning to the state. Now, unfortunately, the actual outcome and deliberations on Hannah's petition aren't known, But Hannah did return to Chester County in December of 1782. And if she'd received a pass, then her petition revealed the willingness of councilmen to let women with loyalist ties and associations return to and reestablish residence in the state. And if she returned without one, then her mobility is illuminating ways that women could somewhat subvert attempts by Pennsylvanians to keep women linked to loyalists outside state boundaries, even as the war was reaching its end. And after 1781 and Yorktown, we also saw some pass applications be accepted with more regularity as fears began to lessen. Now, during the war, women's petitioning efforts had reflected their altered economic circumstances, and women's requests to the government intertwined with the needs of the state at war. After 1783, there was a great amount of continuity. Women continued petitioning as before, economic conditions weren't immediately better, and the disruptions that had been caused in the years of war continued to shape women's household economies. And of course, legislators would still deliberate on women's requests. This continuity in women's petitioning efforts is especially clear in cases when women's petitioning spans the wartime and post-war years. Margaret Miller began petitioning in the late 1770s, but it took her 14 years and multiple petitions to an array of boards and governing bodies before she received a pension. And I have for you on the slide just two images from government minutes in Pennsylvania where Margaret and her case are appearing for deliberation and debate. Back in 1776, her husband had joined the Americans as a commissioned officer, but he died in November at Fort Washington. The following April, she wrote to the Board of War seeking support for herself and 6 small children. But her petition got engulfed in changes in some of the state's military structure, and she did not receive support at that time. 4 years later, she petitioned Pennsylvania's General Assembly. Legislators sent a request to the Committee of Grievances. And upon review, the committee determined that there was no state law that could give her relief, but a resolve of Congress might apply to her situation. Members recommended her case back to the Board of War, her starting place of 4 years earlier. And why they did so is a little unclear because the 1780 state law had clearly extended relief to widows, and county orphans courts were meant to determine level of payments and establish sort of a pension claim. 2 more years passed, though, before Margaret took her case to the Orphans Court. In March of 1782, though, she did, and the court directed the treasurer to pay her one sum of £478 and then the sum of £22 and 10 shillings quarterly for her widowhood. The following November, though, she was back at the General Assembly to complain that the treasurer informed her that he could pay no money. Between 1782 and 1791, Margaret waited for a determination on and payment for the pension that was granted her. The Philadelphia Orphans Court reviewed and re-recorded her case finally in March of 1791. That June, she swore before the court that she was still a widow, and that was something that widows had to do annually after 1790. And the state finally issued her her first payments. Then, until her death in 1804, Margaret did collect her quarterly pension with very few inconsistencies. Pensions could offer much needed economic support, but the requirements and the process to obtain and continue to receive payments kept widowed recipients in really close relationships with the state, and sometimes, as in this case, pulled women to prolonged and drawn out cycles of petitioning. And when that process of petitioning was drawn out and women were pulled into ever more entangled relationships and dependencies on the state for payments, they could be waiting years to have a decision on need or aid that they really needed. Mary Blair of Cumberland County petitioned the Executive Council in March of 1789 for the payment of support that was previously granted her but was still unpaid. Her husband, James, went into service in 1778. He left Mary as the only guardian for their 3 children in a very confined means of subsistence, she said, and when he died, she had to sell a part of their land to support the family. Mary applied to the Orphans Court as was required, and she was granted a sum for the support of herself and her family. So she then laid those orders before the Executive Council, who granted orders on the state treasury for money that was supposed to be paid out of the militia fines for Cumberland County. The treasurer was supposed to pay her £15 and 15 shillings, the allowance for the time of her widowhood, and then also the sum of £69 and 5 shillings for the support of herself and her children. But when she actually applied for this money, she was informed there was none in the treasury arising from the said fines. So she wrote to the government. I therefore could obtain no assistance, although in the greatest need, she told the council, because the honorable assembly of this commonwealth at the last session have passed a law which stops the collection of any more militia fines, by which means I am effectually barred from the least shadow of hope to recover money upon the orders granted me by your honorable body. Mary sought support from the common treasury, but councilmen decided that they could not pay her from that source and actually advised her to withdraw her petition. So even though the state determined she was owed support, it simultaneously deemed that that support wasn't crucial enough to be paid. Mary was awarded aid on paper, pulled into a prolonged process of trying to obtain that, and then ultimately denied support because the original lines of funding weren't sufficient. It was one thing to obtain a pension, and it was quite another to actually collect this major source of support in widowhood. Prolonged engagements with the state mirrored what happened during the revolution when women appeared before varying boards and governing bodies and when they had to submit multiple petitions for support. The process and economic conditions that women faced after 1783 were hardly any better. Women's need and petitioning didn't stop after, again, war's end, but the petitions that the state received were increasingly just from war widows. And at the same time, pension claims from aging male veterans really came to overshadow the petitions that women or widows of war were submitting. And legislators and legislative debates about the state's role in supporting aging veterans and just pensions more broadly likewise favored the male pensioner base. But in spite of that shift, women were still petitioning into the 19th century, and they were very often doing so until their deaths. Pennsylvania women who were aligned with loyalists also continued to petition in the post-war. Some of those applicants had fled or had already fled the United States, but others remained or returned to the state. And any who could demonstrate loyalty or service to the British and lost property during the Revolution could petition the British government for support via the Loyalist Claims Commission. In 1786, Hannah Lewis traveled from Chester County to Halifax, Nova Scotia to submit a claim to the commissioners that were sent to British North America. She detailed Curtis's service, which she said left his family destitute of subsistence, and she also outlined the family's property loss, which was valued at £2,000 sterling, or a little over £2,000 sterling. A key part of Hannah's argument before the commission not only was about loyalism and property loss, but was also about her dower rights. Curtis had died intestate, and as his widow, Hannah had a right to her third. And she outlined the intricacies of Pennsylvania's property laws to the commissioners, and she used that to really bolster her request for them to support her. Commissioners did pick up on that language and that request, and when they granted Hannah the sum of £120 towards the losses, they defined it in terms of dower. 70 for her right in dower in real estate of her late husband, and 50 in compensation toward her thirds in Curtis's personal estate. That £120 that was granted Hannah would have brought some stability and needed support to her household, and she returned to Pennsylvania. Now, that sum, though not insignificant, wasn't enough to keep Hannah out of debt, though, by the early 1790s. And perhaps because of that debt, Hannah started petitioning again. In 1793, Hannah petitioned Pennsylvania's House seeking dower to be paid from Curtis's confiscated estate. And I have two images for you here from this 1793 moment when her petition is showing up in the Pennsylvania House. The House committee that was appointed to examine her case found that after the debts against Curtis's estate were paid, that a balance of just over £128 remained. And induced from motives of justice and humanity, the committee recommended that Hannah receive the interest of the balance, which was £7, 14 shillings and 2 pence. And she was to get that sum annually until her death. Having tabled her case, the House then revisited it in the following December, and debate carried it into 1794 before the House finally sent it to the Senate. When Pennsylvania's Senate read a bill for Hannah's relief, they voted on it, but the bill was lost. In December of 1797, Hannah petitioned again to the Senate this time, praying that her case be reconsidered. The Senate then sent her bill back to the House, but it was tabled there until January of 1798. Legislators didn't revisit her case until mid-December, and even then, they came to no decision. Then, 11 years later, in March of 1809, Hannah and her petition appear one more time. By this time, Hannah was 74 years old, and she'd been petitioning for quite a while. Here again, she asked for her dower. And in December of 1809, the House voted to take up her case at the next session, but then she and her petition dropped from the records, and it seems that Hannah and her petition never succeeded. And you'll see here on this image that not only is Hannah still asking for compensation, but she's also now ended up as a resident of Delaware County in 1789, what is now Delaware County, split off from Chester, and she was living in Haverford. As a petitioner, Hannah was arguing both before the British and the Pennsylvania governments for support, and then her dower. And that request for dower, the latter, she had a belief that her legal rights as a widow were really following her through wartime and beyond. And while Hannah may have been somewhat unique in the extent of her petitioning efforts in going both before the American and British governments, she wasn't alone. Women with loyalist connections who resided in the state had petitioned Pennsylvania's government for relief in the post-war. And they were doing so kind of drawing on wartime precedent because women associated with loyalists had petitioned for passes, and they'd also petitioned for support from those confiscated estates. And throughout the conflict and after, British loyalties and associations weren't precluding the Pennsylvania government from accepting or deliberating on these women's petitions. So, what does all this petitioning mean to us and for our understanding of women and the revolution? When we're looking broadly at women petitioners over the course of the war and then after, we see a great number of shared experiences and continuity. Patriots, loyalists, and women whose politics are a lot less evident are all petitioning the state. And in fact, one's political persuasions or associations actually matter a lot less in this story than you might expect. Women in need petitioned, and sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they had to petition again and again. And sometimes when they did, they were pulled into a prolonged process of that petitioning. And that then was a shared experience for white Anglo-American women during and after the war, again, really regardless of politics. Petitioning was an important economic skill that women had, and it was essential. And even if they didn't always bring women assured or sufficient support, the outcomes of their petitions matter less than the fact that they could petition at all and carved out a space for themselves in this political process. The American Revolution mattered in the lives of these women because it created the conditions by which numerous women engaged with the state via petitioning, and by which they brought their need, their requests, and really details about their household economies before governing bodies. And it put their real and pressing needs into conversations with legislators and Pennsylvania's governance more broadly. Thank you. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Camille. For some reason, I'm having trouble getting my video to go back on, so this is a little odd. But can you hear my voice?
I see you.
Oh,
so.
Okay, great. I just can't see myself, so that's just
Oh no.
Well, it's wonderful to hear what you've been working on for these past 5, 6, 7 years, and we really appreciate hearing what you've learned about the economic circumstances and efforts of these Pennsylvania women. So I want to encourage our guests to enter any questions they have into the chat, but I will get us started with one. So we all saw that in your last few images there, we saw the library company label on the side, and it's always interesting to me to hear how people have been excavating the collections at the library company and our partner institution, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So can you start by telling us a little bit about just the physical form that the petitioning records take? I could see it was a kind of narrative form, and what kind of critical eye you have to bring to those narratives as you interpret them.
Sure. I'll start with petitioning, then go into the sources I looked at. So petitions are a very kind of formulaic document in themselves. And so when you're reading them, they often start your petition humbly showeth, or something along those lines. And so we do have to be really aware of the kind of rhetoric that's there. And women, of course, in this case, are often telling stories of great need, and they have a narrative format, and they're using language that does describe their distressing circumstances. But one way we can kind of corroborate that is by looking also in other county records and just records where I can find these women elsewhere in Pennsylvania too. And we see that, you know, they're telling the truth. And other historians have also commented on that, yes, this has a formulaic element, but we shouldn't dismiss the things that women are telling legislators because of that formula. So you often get these, again, sign for requests, it's very formulaic, and then you'll get a decision. If you're lucky, there are some petitions that I have absolutely no idea what happened in terms of the deliberation, because they're either lost, they don't show up in the minutes again, or it's just really unclear what the council was, you know, thinking of. So in that sense, that can be a bit of an issue. There's also the issue where sometimes these petitions that survive are sort of a record of women coming before the government, and so the clerk is kind of writing for them, so that they're not always in their hand, which of course is also something to be cognizant of. And so petitions are a major part of my source base, but actually some of the things that I've been, you know, really looking at in the library company's records in particular are other government records that help me kind of get at these petitions and what they mean. So I spent quite a bit of time just reading all of the printed minutes of Pennsylvania's government from 1775 to 1812, which the library company has. And so that's been great to just be able to read them. And then also things like the McAllister collection, which have some of these other petitions and records of the Pennsylvania government, give me these little snippets of things that fill in what's going on in petitions and in government records. So that has been a collection that's really essential. And it's actually something I was just looking at this week and finding some more war widows and veterans and things of that nature. And of course, the collections at the HSP in terms of some of the manuscript collections, I've found quite a bit on Hannah Lewis, a lot more on Sarah Kennedy, who I didn't talk that much about, but those records have been really essential at getting at sort of women's experiences beyond the petition as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, we have a question from one of our guests who would like to know whether these women needed a lawyer to file a petition or whether they could simply write a personal letter themselves.
Yeah, so that is something that's also not always clear from the petitions. A lot of the ones that go directly to the council do appear to be women acting on their own and doing this. They will sometimes have other signatures of males. Sometimes there is someone who does appear to be a lawyer on that. I'm thinking of Hannah Lewis here. She has an individual acting as an attorney for her as she's preparing some of her early claim, but then she does then take it. So they are sometimes involved in the process, but it doesn't necessarily seem that it is a requirement for some of these women to go to the state.
I see. Okay. So I know you've looked at records of many women, but you settled on two as sort of your case studies that you come back to again and again: Hannah Lewis and Sarah Kennedy. So can you talk to us about how you found your subjects? How did you settle on them? How did you discover them?
Yeah, so Hannah, I found a little bit by chance, or not by chance, but going through the Loyalist records, the index of the Loyalist claims, and I found her. She seemed quite interesting, and I was able to then use her name to look for her. And I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find very much. And then all of a sudden one day I found a lot. And so I had started with that Loyalist claim, and luckily that claim had some names of her other family members as well. And Chester County has just a wealth of resources for anyone who's ever researched in that region. So I had some tax lists, had a lot of property records, and then she was also Quaker, so I was able to trace her in Quaker minutes. Sarah Kennedy showed up on a list of women applying for pensions. She did not succeed in getting a pension, even though her husband was a military surgeon, and a Continental Army hospital was on their property. But I found her name, and again, just kind of started digging around and lucked out and was able to follow them. And I did that with several women, and those were the two who sort of appeared with the most sources.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, we have a question in the chat from another fellow from your cohort, Eric Troutman-Mosher, who's also doing a project related to Pennsylvania economy, quite different from yours. But Eric asks, How were successful petitions paid out? Was it in specie or paper money?
That depends, and it also depends sort of in the process of whether it's a one-time payment or an annuity. Sometimes it's a value of a ration, sometimes it's a ration, and it appears to be in Pennsylvania currency in most cases, though it's always not clear. And that's one of those problems of the petitions where they get recorded, the state's recording them, and it does appear to be Pennsylvania. But the loyalist claims, of course, specie in that case.
Okay. A couple more questions coming in quickly here. So, question about race. I'm curious about the ways petitioning connected specifically to the formation of white womanhood as an identity in early Pennsylvania. And in your review of petitions, did you find that these women discussed racialized fears or concerns?
No. And this is something I am thinking about as I extend the project also in terms of thinking about how dependents are affected by these petitions, because a number of them do have enslaved individuals. So I want to deal with that question as I'm here this year, but the ones that I've looked at have not specifically made any statement about race. There is some patriotism in there, so we could potentially speak to it in that way of class, but they're not explicitly stating so.
Okay, thank you. So someone has a comparative question, and I'm going to tack on a question to that too. So our guest asks if you have any sense how similar or different your Pennsylvania women were from women petitioners in other states. And then if you have time, I'm also curious about the differences you're seeing between women's petitions and those of, say, male veterans. But let's start with the question of region first.
Yeah, so I have mostly looked at Pennsylvania, and I wouldn't really feel confident making any broad comparisons in this moment, though given the formulaic nature of petitions, I'm sure that there are some really similar language moments. So that's something I would need to do a little more thinking on, and I don't want to sort of say anything without having enough evidence. In terms of petitions from male veterans, they also use the language of distress, and they're able to use patriotic language a lot. But what we see really being quite different is after 1783, men are becoming petitioners more and more. During the war, women are the petitioners. So we see this kind of subtle shift. And in those moments, men are using the same rhetoric, but women are really still giving more narrative, more details, and really making a stronger argument about sort of their own economic need.
Okay. Well, we have one more question from our guests, and then I will wrap up with a final question as we're getting to the end of our hour. Question is, was the plight of Pennsylvania widows from the Revolution discussed in pamphlets or newspapers in the 1780s and 90s? And if so, what was being said about them?
So I can answer that a little bit. In government minutes, actually, there is some debate about who should get aid, and legislators are kind of speaking about this broadly. And another thing I'm doing here this year is also thinking about other kinds of charity, so I might be able to answer that better a little bit after my time here. But there is some debate about widows as being worthy, and early on they are identified as that. But I wouldn't be able to sort of speak to pamphlets at this point yet, but it's something I should look for. So it's a good question.
Well, you have another year of work with us, so I
I
trust
do.
you to get to that. So I would just like to bring it back to personal records. You've looked at a lot of records of governing bodies and so forth, but you also read from some very compelling personal letters. And I know that you're back here with some further collections that you want to dig into. And you told me that you're going to be looking at the diaries of someone named Grace Galloway. I think those are at the Historical Society.
Yes.
Can you just give us a little bit of a sense of what you hope to find there, or what you have already found about Grace's experience?
Sure. So Grace is, of course, someone who has quite high socioeconomic status in Pennsylvania, her husband being an important first Pennsylvania legislator, but then prominent British supporter. So Grace is a really great source. And in looking at her diary, I am able to really get at some of the anxiety and fear that women have had, and think about how I can draw on her to get at some of these other women who I just have a single petition for. At one point, Grace has a dream about George Washington, and if she fell down, would he extend his hand to her? She dreams about her daughter, who she misses, dearly, being bitten by a rattlesnake. And so she's got some kind of very common, personal commentary going on, and then also talks about the war and is, commenting, oh, the war is lost. Oh, I miss my husband. And then the next sentence, I wish he never got involved in politics. And so with her, I can really kind of beef up some of the kind of personal narrative to really give these petitions even more meaning, I think, because not everyone is Grace Galloway who leaves me a diary, but I can use that to weave in and sort of get at and pull out these other women's experiences for whom I have very little.
Wonderful, and that really brings an intimacy to the project as well.
Yeah.
So we can't wait to see how you take this research further over the coming year, and we wish you the best in your postdoctoral fellowship in the coming year. So thank you so much, Camille. I know our guests will join me in thanking you for all you have shared tonight and wish you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we close tonight, I just want to let our guests know about some terrific events we have coming up. You can always check the Library Company events calendar on our website to see what we have on the horizon. But next week we have, I'm looking forward to attending a talk by my colleague Linda Kimiko August, who's our curator of art and artifacts. Her topic is functional design, library furniture in the collection, and she's going to be looking at some unusual and wonderful furniture pieces in the Library Company's collection. That's Tuesday night. And then next Friday, a week from tomorrow, we will be presenting a jazz concert at Mother Bethel AME Church in Center City, Philadelphia. And that is going to feature our Innovation Fellow, Brent White, who is a local trombonist and educator. And Brent has been studying a manuscript in the Library Company's collection of the 19th century African-American composer and band leader Francis Johnson. And he has composed new jazz arrangements with Afro-Caribbean rhythms based on Francis Johnson's composition. So we're really looking forward to that next Friday night, and we hope that some of you can join us. So Camille, thank you once again. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. You will receive a recording of this event in case you'd like to revisit it. And we hope to see you again at a future event. Good night.
Thank you.